Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American Foreign Policy, and also president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., looking out on the empty streets of the nation's capital. But we are in our office today, and I'm delighted to have a conversation with Nicole Bibbins Sedaca, a professor in Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and has contributed to Providence, or at least spoken at our events, and previously served in the U.S. State Department, and has chaired the board of International Justice Mission, among other accomplishments. So it's great to have you with us.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Mark.
Now, Nicole shares our commitment, our meaning IODs, and Providence, to democracy and human rights and principles of human dignity for all people, which are ultimately rooted in natural law and certainly in Jewish and Christian teaching, but are under much stress right now in America and around the world, particularly coming out of, we hope, the pandemic, and now with the recent protests, sometimes accompanied by riots and increased conversation and distress over racial issues. So Nicole, what are your thoughts in terms of where we are right now in American history and how it affects the future of democracy?
Thanks, Mark. It's a great question, one that has been asked by many people these days and is important to mull over. We are at a time where our democracy is under great strain, but my hope is that out of great strain can come great progress, because I also think the ability for a democracy to deal with some of the most difficult issues happens most often when there is a significant crisis, right? Just as we saw that the international community could actually rally around international standards on human rights and ending genocide only because of the horrors of the Holocaust and the horrors of the Second World War, I am hoping that this time, which is extraordinarily difficult for our country, will challenge us to ask hard questions about democracy and make progress. So let me just talk a little bit about pandemic and a little bit about protest. Obviously, in the pandemic, there are the massive health concerns and the 110,000 people whose lives have been lost and the significant impact on our economy. But let me talk about democracy, because there's a lot of debate right now about, does democracy even matter if we can't handle a pandemic? And maybe authoritarian countries are better, and maybe it's a better thing to so problematic. It's not necessarily the lens through which we have to think through this. Authoritarian governments have done a good job of quick response in some places, but they really have done it at the expense of all of the other things that you need to do well to respond to a pandemic. To respond to a pandemic, it's not just handing out vaccines or asking people to stay in their homes. It is also about a transparent dialogue between experts and a government, between civil society and a government, and to have transparency, to have media openly report on what's going on. All of that ecosystem around the actual medical response is what is always done better in democracies than it is done in authoritarian governments. And we take the case of China, the case of Iran, and we see that very clearly. Doesn't mean that democracies have done a perfect job. We see a lot of democracies, and I would argue that the United States has stumbled quite a bit on our COVID response. But it does mean that to allow the government to be held accountable and the people to voice what they need from their government. In reference to the protests that we're seeing, the United States, in its glorious founding, also sewed into the very fabric of our country the evils of racism and slavery. And that came in this massively dichotomous beginning to our country, where there were these beautiful ideals which were codified and spoken into a country at a time when the country was violating many of those very acts, while it was also building a country that would live into democratic values. And we simply have not worked all of that evil out as our country has progressed forward. And what we're seeing now is sort of the groanings of a society which has not yet fully ensured that those great values upon which our country is founded are realized by everyone in the country. And as painful as this time is, and as difficult as it is, and as difficult as it is to think about how we got to this point through the murders of people in their homes and on the streets by policemen, I am hopeful that those lives will be honored through significant addressing of what are the shortcomings in our democracy. And truthfully, this is something that we should all want greatly, because anywhere in our democracy where there is a weakness, it's in all of our interests to strengthen that weak spot in order to ensure that our democracy is functioning in its fullest form.
Now, the protests are essentially demanding what the civil rights movement demanded in the 50s and 60s, which is the implementation of human equality for all. But the civil rights protests of the 50s and 60s were rooted in basically a biblical anthropology, and they did lay claim to the promises of America's founding. It's not clear, the protest of today, they're making these demands, but it's not clear exactly what foundation upon which they rest these demands. Do you share that same concern?
I don't share it quite in that sense. What I am hopeful for is the demands that are being put on the table are still in the exact same spirit. They may not be using biblical language in all cases, although I will say I am proud of many of the pastors who are speaking up and grounding this in biblical truth. Whether people are grounding it in biblical truth, or they're grounding it in the Constitution, or they're grounding it in what I think is the human desire that comes from natural law to have justice in a society. They may not be naming it, but it is the same roots. And I do think inherently as human beings, we long for justice. We long for equal treatment. I think that is placed on our hearts by God. Other people may not see it that way. That's the way I believe it is placed. But I think the requests that are being put on the table, the desire for equal treatment under the law, is unquestionably deeply consistent with biblical truths and with our democratic principles, even when people are not using that language specifically.
If I understand you correctly, you believe the desire for human freedom is a universal desire that transcends time and culture. That's a somewhat unpopular perspective these days, both on the left and on the right. And ostensibly, or at least some are claiming that we're in a time in which we're witnessing the quote unquote end of liberalism, whatever that means. So that's the spirit in which we're currently operating. Perhaps this is a passing phase. But how do you speak to that moment in terms of making the case for democracy as a universal good for all people?
Yeah. I understand, and in fact, I teach an ethics class in which we talk about where, what is the root, what's the source of your political morality? Does it come from natural law? Does it come from consensualism? Where is it that people draw that from? And I recognize that there is a diversity of views, but I engage people on the actual tangibles of the day-to-day, which is, if you were to ask everyone in the world, do you long to live freely? Do you long to live in a way which the police cannot come in your house and without any cause and abuse you or your family? Do you want to be able to worship freely and openly according to your tradition, or to choose not to worship? Do you want to be able to speak your language or express yourself culturally? I don't know of a human being around the world who would say, no, I would love to have my religious rights completely limited, or I would love to have the government tell me I need to be this religion or I can't switch my religion. I would love for the government to come into my house in the middle of the night and take my children away. It's simply not logical to think that there's anyone in the world who would not want those most foundational things. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of disagreement on other elements of the structure of democracy or specific laws. We do, and those are all worth debating. But when you boil it down to, does the individual human being long to have the freedom to be able to live in a way and express themselves, whether that's linguistically or culturally or religiously, in freedom? I have yet to find in my travels around the world, and I've been to quite a few countries, anyone say, nah, I don't really like that. I'd really rather have the government dictate everything to me, or abuse with impunity. And so that's where, while I recognize that people draw their political morality from different places, it's what just logically to me, as well as my own personal belief, brings me back to just the natural law of the inherent dignity of the human being and the desire of the human spirit to be free in that sense.
I have a perception that perhaps you share, that in terms of Christians in America, especially evangelicals, they would have been very supportive of what was called the Freedom Agenda during the Bush administration years in the early and mid 2000s, and the core intuition that somehow America has a special role in promoting and showcasing freedom for the whole world. I'm not so sure Christians of today have that same conviction or confidence, or if they do, they don't know quite how to articulate it. Do you have that same impression?
I think we are in a complex time. I was privileged to serve in the Bush administration and be part of implementing the Freedom Agenda, and it was a great time in which the United States really sought to infuse our foreign policy with the values that we had at home, and that was something that had been bipartisan for many years. I think the confusion which we're seeing right now is, how do we reconcile the challenges we have at home domestically and our ability or our responsibility or our ability or opportunity to speak overseas? And I think part of that challenge is we have to reconcile, and I do believe that many of these things are deeply consistent with the biblical truths that we have about, as Christians, we recognize that we have deep flaws, that we have deep sin, we have our many shortcomings, but that doesn't prevent us from sharing the goodness and the truth of the gospel because of our shortcomings. I see a similar place for the United States in what I've called, in a few things that I've written recently, humble confidence. And what that means is the United States is deeply humble about where it has fallen short. If we look at 400 years of history, and looking at from an African-American perspective in light of everything that's going on in the country right now, 350 years of that 400 years, African-Americans lived under slavery, which means legalized torture, rape, murder, and they lived under, so of that 350, significant portion under slavery, and then the remainder under Jim Crow, which was quasi-legal torture, rape with impunity. And so the United States has to reconcile the fact that our history has deep, deep flaws. And we continue to make flaws. We continue to make errors because we are a human group of people that continue to make errors. So that's the humility part. But the other part, the confidence part, is the ideals upon which this country was founded. The democratic values, the democratic institutions, the rightness of those do not change because we have at times failed to live into them. And if we look back at some of the greatest people who have brought democratic change in our country, Reverend Martin Luther King, who did draw so much of what he spoke about directly from the Bible, he used all of the democratic values, he used the democratic institutions, he used the documents that founded our country to push for the change because the values were the right ones, we were just not living into them. And so when we're able to speak with humble confidence and say we are rock solid confident about the values of our country, the importance of democracy in our country, and we're going to admit it when we fall short, that I think is a rock solid example to the world. And it helps people who tend to fall into the extremes, which want to say, the United States is the worst country. It makes all these mistakes. Look at this, look at this, look at this. The United States has nothing to give the world. Or the others who say, the United States is the best. We're the city on the hill without blemish. And what I think we should say is we are a beacon. We are an example, but that example is made stronger by being honest about our shortcomings and being diligent about using democratic values, using democratic institutions to address those shortcomings in order to become a stronger and more democratic society.
So the negative perspective on events in America over the last month or two would be, this is a collapse of democracy, a failure to live up to our historic stated ideals, and essentially we're imploding towards extreme versions of tribalism or identity politics. The more positive version would be, no, we still are striving to lay claim to the promises of our founding ideals, and this is just the latest chapter in that movement. I assume you would side with a more positive perspective.
I am deeply fully in the second category. Democracy in no way promises that you will not have problems or that everyone will behave perfectly and wonderfully. What it does say is there will be a structure around the society to deal with the worst of who we are and to allow the best of who we are. I'm actually deeply moved by the protests that we see because that is what democracy is. Democracy is not just elections and the White House and the Capitol building. Democracy is individual human beings finding challenges in their society and raising their voice and demanding change, and our lawmakers and our executive leaders responding. That is actually democracy. So while it is deeply painful for me that we actually have to even have protests because there are still issues in our society and very real, deep issues in our society, I am really amazed and moved by the courage and the vision of the people who are in the streets peacefully protesting. And I am thankful for the lawmakers who are responding. That is democracy. What I think we need to watch is the protests are democracy in action. What is the response? When the response is, let's dialogue, let's talk about it, let's make legislative changes, let's have the right policies in place, that is democracy at its best. When the response to peaceful protest is closing of space, silencing of voices, non-responsiveness, that's when we need to start worrying about our democracy. And I think for all of us who are engaged in this process, whether we are doing peaceful protests, I was at a prayer march last weekend, or we are writing to our Congress people, or we are voting, whatever we do, we need to ensure that how we are engaging is done democratically, and how we are judging our leaders is with a democratic measuring stick, if you will. Is their response, even if they disagree with us or they might be a different party, or is their response done democratically? Are they opening the space? Are they opening the dialogue? Are they looking for public policy to address the issues that are on the table? That measuring stick, which should not have a party label, which should not have a race label, which should not have a gender label or a religious label, that measuring stick of, is this democratic, is what's going to be the most important indicator as to how our country will move forward out of this time that we're in right now.
And then finally, you speak of America as city on the hill and as ideally an exemplar of democracy to the world. There are those who say that recent events have besmirched America's image to the world, that we're a society in upheaval, unable to address our deep divisions. And of course, we have demonstrations overseas regarding America's problems while largely ignoring, say, China's suppression of human rights in Hong Kong, not to mention human rights suppressions around the world. But I think you would say, correct me if I'm wrong, that no, in fact, what's happening in America right now is a demonstration of the glories of democracy and of the right of the people to protest. And in fact, as the world watches, this will have in a positive way, a deeply subversive impact on repressive regimes around the world. Would you agree?
I would agree with that if we respond to this moment with more democracy. The world and the United States' legitimacy overseas and how the world sees us will not be based on whether we have problems and whether we have protesters. It will be based on how we respond to the problems and how we respond to the protesters. Problems exist. In our case, deep, deep problems exist. Protesters are people who are voicing their opinion. That is the demos of democracy. If the government at all levels responds, as I said, with more transparency, more openness, more willingness to say, this is a legacy. This is a legacy from these deep, painful evils that were sewn into the fabric of our society early on. Let's wrestle with them. Let's deal with them. My goodness, we will be a model for the world. And it will be subversive because we will be able to say to China, you have problems too, we have problems too. How are you dealing with ours? Here's how we dealt with ours. We reformed our police. We changed this law. We are in a dialogue with these different people. This is how we responded to the needs of our people. How are you doing that to the Uyghurs who are interned in your country? It will be deeply subversive, deeply radical, because it will say the way you respond to the most difficult problems is with more openness, more transparency, and more government accountability to the citizens who at the end of the day are whose voice matters in our government. If we don't respond that way, we will be saying to the Chinas and to the Irans and to the Russias of the world, you know what, it's okay. Even us democracies, we'll just silence these voices. We will put them to the side. So what we do now, not whether we have protests or whether we have problems in our society, how our government responds will be a huge example and setting for how the globe will see how to deal with these very difficult problems in a society. And the choice is ours. So we will see.
Dr. Nicole Bibbins Sedaca of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, thank you for an insightful, encouraging, and hopeful conversation.
You bet, you bet. I have hope that we will move our country forward with more democracy and closer collaboration through this difficult time. Thanks for the conversation, Mark. I appreciate the work you and the Institute are doing.